All right, let's dive into something that's really central to Catholic life, but also carries a whole lot of weight: the formal obligation to go to Mass. So, what actually happens if you just don't go?
And boom, right out of the gate, the teaching hits you with this: grave sin. I mean, that's a phrase with some serious theological power behind it. But what does it really mean? And why would the Church make a claim that sounds so intense? That's exactly what we're going to unpack here.
So you might be wondering, how do they justify a rule this strict? Well, the source material gives us 5 main reasons, and they all kind of build on each other to create the foundation for this whole idea.
And it's pretty fascinating how these all connect. See, it starts with a very basic idea, a moral duty to worship God, the Creator. But then it gets more specific. The Mass is seen as the absolute highest form of prayer because it's where Christ's sacrifice is made present all over again. It's also not just a you and God thing, it's a public communal statement that you belong to the Church. And finally, and this is a really interesting point, it's framed as a kind of pastoral help, a way to give people a structure to fight against, our natural laziness or half-heartedness.
Okay, this all leads to a huge question. It's one thing to have good reasons, but where does an institution get the authority to say that skipping a service is a grave sin? How can they even make that rule?
Well, the Church points directly to Scripture for its authority, and specifically to this line from the Gospel of Matthew. This whole idea of binding and loosing is understood as Jesus giving his apostles and the popes and bishops who came after them the actual power to set the rules for the community of believers. And this power has a name: judicial authority. You can think of it as the basis for the Church to create what it calls precepts, basically rules and disciplines meant to guide how its members live and worship.
So here's the real kicker. From the Church's perspective, the seriousness of skipping Mass isn't just about missing an event. It's about the act of deliberately disobeying an authority that's believed to be established by God. It's seen as rejecting the Church's legitimate judgment, and because of that, it's seen as rejecting Christ himself.
But was this always the rule? Is this a modern invention, or does it have deeper roots? Well, let's take a look at how this whole idea actually developed over the centuries.
This timeline shows a really incredible journey. It all started simply with the early Christians getting together for the breaking of the bread. Then, for hundreds of years during the persecutions, just showing up was a crime you could be executed for. I mean, people literally risked death to go. That really cemented its importance. The formal rules came much later, starting around 300 AD with penalties for missing, and it all got solidified in the 1600s when Pope Innocent XI made it crystal clear that this was a serious, binding obligation. Okay, so we've looked at the justification, the authority, and the history. Now let's get down to brass tacks. What does that term, grave sin, actually mean in this context?
So the teaching basically splits sin into 2 categories. You have venial sin, which wounds your relationship with God but doesn't totally break it. But then you have mortal or grave sin, and that's understood as something much more serious, an act that completely destroys love or charity in your soul and turns you away from God.
But, and this is absolutely crucial, it's not automatic. For any act to be considered a mortal sin, 3 conditions all have to be met. First, the thing itself has to be serious. That's the grave matter. Second, you have to have full knowledge, meaning you actually know it's a sin. And third, you have to give deliberate consent, which means you freely choose to do it anyway. If any one of those is missing, it's not a mortal sin.
Now, before we wrap this up, there's one more important detail. This obligation to attend Mass, it's not just for Sundays. It also applies to a specific list of other major feast days throughout the year.
Yep, these are called holy days of obligation. They celebrate some of the biggest events and figures in the faith, like Christmas, the Assumption of Mary, and All Saints' Day. And the key thing to remember is that, according to this teaching, every single one of these days carries the exact same serious obligation as a Sunday.
So there you have it. We've walked through the what, the why, and the how of this core Catholic teaching. And what it leaves us with is this really intense intersection of personal freedom and institutions' authority and what are believed to be eternal consequences, which really brings us to a final, pretty deep question to think about.